The morning of my wedding began in a way that would have once terrified me, but by then had become a familiar, if unwelcome, part of my life. I woke up in a quiet hotel room, the soft light of early autumn filtering through the curtains, and for a few suspended seconds everything felt exactly as it should, calm, expectant, almost sacred. Then I tried to move my left hand. It did not respond in the way I expected. It wasn't the dull, tingling numbness of a limb that had fallen asleep. It was something stranger, more disorienting, as if my hand had simply stepped out of the agreement my body and I had made years ago. I watched my fingers flex, slow and deliberate, but the sensation was absent, like I was controlling something that didn't belong to me. On any other day this might have unraveled me. Years earlier it would have. But this was not a new phenomenon. This was multiple sclerosis, my constant, unpredictable companion since I was 23, reminding me again. That control was always conditional. I lay there for a moment, letting the reality settle instead of fighting it. The date, October 14th, hovered in my mind with significance that should have overshadowed everything else. In a few hours I would be marrying Daniel, the person who had come to understand this strange, shifting landscape of my body better than most doctors ever could. And yet here I was negotiating with my nervous system before I had even left the bed. I began the grounding routine I had learned in the early years after my diagnosis, when mornings like this used to spiral into panic. I counted my breath, slow and measured. I named what I could see: the ceiling fan turning lazily above me, the white carnation in a glass vase on the nightstand, my wedding dress hanging with quiet certainty on the closet door, the narrow beam of sunlight slipping through the wedding light, curtains. These small anchors pulled me back into the present, into something steady. Multiple sclerosis does not announce itself politely. It interrupts, rewrites, and rearranges without permission. Some days it is a whisper fatigue that lingers a little too long, a slight tremor that passes unnoticed by anyone else. Other days, like this one, it is a disruption that demands attention. The version I live with is called relapsing remitting MS, which means my symptoms come and go, flaring unpredictably and then receding just enough to create the illusion of normalcy. I have spent nearly a decade learning its patterns, or rather learning that it does not truly have any. It is a condition defined by uncertainty, by negotiations I did not agree to, governed by rules I cannot see. By the time I sat up in bed, sensation had begun to return in faint, uneven signals, first in my fingertips, then slowly spreading like static resolving into sound. This too was familiar, the body finding its way back piece by piece. I had learned not to rush it, not to demand more than it was ready to give. There was a time when I would have interpreted this as a warning, a sign that something was about to go wrong, that the day ahead would be defined by limitation. But experience had reshaped that instinct. This was not a warning. It was simply information. A reminder of the reality I lived in, one that did not pause for important dates or carefully planned milestones. What mattered was not that it was happening, but how I chose to meet it. I had a wedding to get ready for. I had a life I had built carefully and deliberately around this unpredictability, not in denial of it, but in partnership with it. And so I breathed, waited, and allowed my body the time it needed to return to me. By the time the morning fully arrived, bringing with it the quiet movement of preparation and the soft knock of someone coming to help me dress my hand, was mine again. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Enough for this moment, for this day, for the life I was about to step into. My relationship with my mother did not fracture in a single moment. It eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first, shaped by years of misunderstanding that neither of us seemed able or willing to fully confront. To understand her, you have to understand the world she came from. My mother, Barbara Renner, grew up in a household where illness was not something to be tended to with care, but something to be endured quietly or dismissed altogether. Weakness in that environment was not just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. It was equated with burden, and burden was something to be avoided at all costs. She learned early that love was often conditional on usefulness, that the safest way to exist was to need as little as possible while giving as much as she could. By the time she became a mother herself, that belief system had hardened into something almost immovable, something she carried into our lives without ever questioning its shape or its consequences. When my symptoms first began in my early 20s, I did not immediately have a diagnosis, only a series of unsettling changes that I could not explain. The fatigue came first, heavy and unrelenting, the kind that made even simple movements feel like effort. Then came the visual disturbances, the strange flickers at the edge of my vision, followed by pain that moved unpredictably through my body. I remember calling my mother during those early months, trying to describe what was happening, hoping for concern or at least curiosity. What I received instead was something colder, something that felt like doubt disguised as practicality. She would listen just long enough to respond with phrases that seemed reasonable on the surface. "You're probably just stressed," or "You've always pushed yourself too hard." But beneath them was an implication that settled heavily in my chest, that what I was experiencing was not entirely real, or at least, not real enough to matter. As the months passed and the symptoms persisted, her skepticism did not soften. It sharpened. Each new doctor I saw, each inconclusive test result, seemed to reinforce her belief that the problem was not in my body but in my mind. She constructed an explanation that was easier for her to accept, one where my struggles could be categorized as anxiety, depression, or some failure to adapt to adulthood. In her version of events, I was not sick, I was avoiding responsibility, seeking attention, or creating problems where none truly existed. I began to recognize a pattern in the way she looked at me during that time, a subtle narrowing of her eyes, a tightening around her mouth, as though she were trying to reconcile the person she believed she had raised with the person I appeared to be becoming. And when she couldn't reconcile it, she chose disbelief. Even after my diagnosis was confirmed, after the long, exhausting process of seeing multiple specialists and finally sitting in a neurologist's office hearing the words relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis, her reaction did not transform in the way I had secretly hoped it would. There was no clear moment of recognition, no apology for the months of doubt. Instead, her skepticism adapted. She no longer denied the diagnosis outright, but she minimized its impact, treating it as something exaggerated, something I was allowing to define me more than necessary. It was as though acknowledging the full reality of my condition would require her to confront a deeper fear that illness could exist without reason, without fault, and without the possibility of being controlled through sheer will. There were moments when her disbelief surfaced in ways that were impossible to ignore. I remember one family gathering where I used a mobility aid to conserve energy, something my doctor and I had carefully decided would improve my quality of life. My mother watched me from across the room with a kind of quiet disapproval that felt heavier than open criticism. Later, she made a comment lightly delivered but unmistakably pointed, about how I looked fine and how perhaps I was relying too much on things that made me seem more limited than I actually was. It was not the words themselves that hurt the most, but the certainty behind them, the way she spoke as though she understood my body better than I did, as though my lived experience required her validation to be legitimate. Over time, her responses became less surprising but no less painful. Each instance of doubt, each subtle dismissal reinforced a divide that neither of us knew how to bridge. I stopped looking to her for understanding because it became clear that what I needed from her, belief, empathy, a willingness to accept what she could not control, was something she could not easily give. And yet, despite everything, there was still a part of me that hoped she might change. That one day she would see me not as a reflection of her fears or failures, but simply as her daughter navigating a reality that was already difficult enough without having to prove its validity. That hope lingered quiet and persistent, even as the distance between us continued to grow. If my relationship with my mother was defined by doubt, then the rest of my life was defined by the people who chose again and again to believe me. Over the years, I learned that support is not something abstract or performative. It is specific, consistent, and often quiet. It shows up in the details, in the way someone listens without trying to correct your experience, in the way they adjust their expectations without making you feel like a burden. Daniel was the clearest example of this. From the beginning, he approached my condition not as something to be solved, but as something to be understood. On our second date, he asked me about my treatment plan, not out of curiosity alone, but with the attentiveness of someone who intended to remember the answer. He did not interrupt, did not offer suggestions pulled from articles or anecdotes. He listened fully, and in that listening there was a kind of respect I had not realized I had been missing. Over time, that respect became the foundation of our relationship. He learned the rhythms of my good days and bad days, the subtle shifts in my energy, the signals I sometimes ignored myself. He never framed these things as limitations. Instead, he treated them as part of the reality we were building, together, something to be navigated side by side. Josephine, my best friend, brought a different kind of support, fierce, instinctive, and unwavering. Where Daniel was steady, Josephine was immediate. She did not hesitate when I needed her. She simply appeared. There was a winter storm a few years ago when my symptoms flared badly, and I made the mistake of mentioning it in passing. 4 hours later, she was at my door, having driven through conditions most people would have avoided, carrying groceries and a kind of determined calm that made it clear she was not leaving until she knew I was okay. She never made a spectacle of these moments. She did not frame them as sacrifices. To her, this was simply what it meant to care about someone. She understood my mother in ways I sometimes resisted, recognizing patterns I preferred to overlook, and while she never pushed me to confront them before I was ready, she remained alert in a way that made me feel protected without being controlled. Dina, my caregiver, was part of my life in a more structured way but no less important. She brought a practical, grounded presence to situations that might otherwise have felt overwhelming. There is a particular kind of dignity in being helped by someone who knows how to offer assistance without taking over, who understands that independence is not about doing everything alone, but about having control over how support is given. Dina respected that boundary instinctively. On mornings when my body felt unpredictable, she moved through the routine with quiet efficiency, never rushing me, never making the situation feel more urgent than it was. Her presence allowed me to conserve energy not just physically but mentally, freeing me from the constant calculation of what I could or could not manage on my own. And then there was Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been part of my life longer than any of them except Josephine. As my neurologist, he occupied a role that was both clinical and deeply personal. He was the one who had given a name to what I was experiencing, who had guided me through the uncertainty of early treatment, and who continued to adjust that treatment as my condition evolved. But his support extended beyond medical expertise. He had a way of delivering difficult information without diminishing its weight, of acknowledging the reality of my situation without allowing it to define the entirety of my life. Over 9 years, he became a constant in a landscape that often felt unstable. Someone whose presence signaled that even when things changed, there was still a plan, still a path forward. Together, these people formed a kind of counterbalance to the narrative my mother had built. Where she saw weakness, they saw adaptation. Where she questioned the legitimacy of my experience, they accepted it without hesitation. They did not require proof, did not ask me to justify the way my body behaved. Instead, they met me where I was again and again with a consistency that reshaped the way I understood support itself. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed, steady and reliable in the background of my life, making it possible for me to move forward even when the ground beneath me felt uncertain. In the months leading up to the wedding, my mother did not oppose it in any obvious confrontational way. Instead, she worked through something far more subtle and in many ways more exhausting erosion. It began with small comments, the kind that could easily be dismissed if taken individually but accumulated into something heavier over time. She would ask questions that sounded practical on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of judgment: whether the venue was truly accessible, whether certain accommodations might make guests uncomfortable, whether the ceremony would look the way a wedding is supposed to look. Each question positioned my needs as inconveniences, as deviations from an imagined standard she seemed determined to preserve. The wheelchair in particular became a focal point of her concern, though she rarely addressed it directly. Instead, she circled it, referencing aesthetics, photographs, and the impression it might leave on others, as though the visual narrative of the day mattered more than the physical reality of the person at its center. At first, I tried to engage with her in good faith, answering her questions, explaining the decisions Daniel and I had made together and the reasons behind them. I told her about the layout of the chapel, about the planning we had done to ensure that everything would run smoothly, about the fact that these accommodations were not last-minute adjustments but integral parts of how I moved through the world. But each explanation seemed to open the door to another concern. Another suggestion that perhaps things could be done differently, more simply, more normally. There was a pattern to it, one I recognized but struggled to confront. She was not asking for information. She was attempting to reshape the situation into something she could accept, something that aligned with her long-held belief that visible signs of illness should be minimized, if not hidden altogether. As the wedding approached, the tone of her comments shifted in subtle but significant ways. What had once been framed as questions began to carry more directive weight. She would make offhand remarks about how meaningful it would be for me to walk, even if only for part of the ceremony, emphasizing the emotional impact such a moment would have on the guests. She spoke about it as though it were a simple choice, something I could decide based on preference rather than medical reality. When I explained that my mobility on any given day was not something I could guarantee, that walking even a short distance required careful consideration and often came at a physical cost. Later, she would go quiet, not in agreement but in a way that suggested she was storing the disagreement for later use. That silence became one of the most telling aspects of her behavior, a pause that signaled not resolution but accumulation. There were moments when her concern for appearances became more explicit. During one conversation about the ceremony, she mentioned the photographs, the way those images would be preserved and shared, and how important it was for them to reflect a certain kind of beauty. She did not say outright that the wheelchair disrupted that image, but the implication was clear enough that it did not need to be stated. I remember feeling a familiar tightening in my chest. The same sensation I had experienced years earlier when she first began to question the legitimacy of my symptoms. It was not just that she failed to understand, it was that she seemed unwilling to adjust her perspective, even when presented with the reality of my condition. The focus remained fixed on how things appeared, rather than how they actually were. Over time, these interactions began to shape the emotional landscape of the wedding planning process. What should have been a period of anticipation and joy became something more complicated, layered with a tension that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. I found myself preparing for conversations with her in the same way I prepared for medical appointments, gathering information, anticipating objections, rehearsing responses. It was exhausting. Not because of the content of what we discussed, but because of the underlying need to defend decisions that should not have required justification in the first place. Daniel noticed it before I fully acknowledged it myself. He would ask me gently how I was feeling after I spoke with her, and I would often deflect, minimizing the impact in the same way I had learned to do with my symptoms years earlier. But the tension was there, building quietly beneath the surface. By the final weeks before the wedding, the pattern had become unmistakable. My mother's comments were no longer isolated instances. They formed a continuous thread of resistance that ran through nearly every aspect of the planning. And yet there was still a part of me that believed, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of hope, that she would not cross a certain line, that, whatever her reservations, she would ultimately choose to support me on the day itself. It was a belief rooted less in evidence than in a kind of emotional persistence, the desire for a moment of recognition that had never fully arrived. In hindsight, the signs were all there: the gradual escalation, the increasing focus on control and appearance, the unresolved tensions that had been quietly accumulating for months. But at the time, I held on to the idea that the significance of the day would be enough to override them. That something as important as a wedding might finally create the space for understanding. The moments just before the ceremony unfolded with a strange, suspended tension, the kind that only becomes visible in hindsight. I was waiting in the vestibule of the chapel, positioned just out of sight of the guests, where the air felt cooler and quieter than it should have on a day like that. Through the closed doors, I could hear the faint movement of people taking their seats, the low hum of conversation, gradually settling into anticipation. My father stood beside me, adjusting his cufflinks in a way that suggested he needed something to do with his hands. I was focused on my breathing, steady and deliberate, the same way I had been that morning, grounding myself in the reality of what was about to happen. In a few minutes, those doors would open and I would move forward into a life I had chosen with someone who had chosen me just as fully. That thought anchored me, held me in place against the quiet undercurrent of nerves that ran through everything. Then my mother appeared. She moved quickly with a kind of purpose that immediately disrupted the fragile calm of the moment. There was something in her expression that I recognized before she even spoke, an intensity that meant she had already decided what was going to happen regardless of anyone else in the room. She came to stand directly behind my wheelchair and placed her hands firmly on the handles. It was such a small, ordinary gesture in any other context, but in that moment it felt like a line being crossed. My father shifted beside me, his movement hesitant, as though he sensed what was coming but did not yet know how to respond. I turned slightly enough to see her face, and before I could speak, she did. "You are not going down that aisle like this," she said, her voice low but sharp, each word controlled in a way that made it more forceful, not less. For a second I thought I had misheard her, that the meaning of the sentence had not fully landed. But then she continued, her grip tightening slightly on the chair. "You are going to walk." There was no room in her tone for discussion, no opening for explanation. It was not a question or even a suggestion, it was a directive delivered with the certainty of someone who believed she was correcting a mistake. I felt a familiar tension rise in my chest, the same one that had accompanied so many conversations with her over the years, but sharper, now amplified by the timing, by the fact that this was happening here now minutes before the ceremony. I kept my voice as steady as I could. Mom let go of the chair. "This is your wedding day," she said, as though that explained everything, as though the significance of the occasion could override the reality of my body. "People are going to be watching. You can do this. Just stand up." Her words landed in a way that was both predictable and disorienting. Part of me had always known she might push for something like this, but knowing it in theory was different from experiencing it in practice. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides, the expectation, the time, the awareness that just beyond the doors were 87 people, waiting unaware of what was unfolding just out of sight. My father said her name softly. A warning that carried no real force behind it, and she ignored him. "I am not walking," I said more firmly, this time forcing each word into place. "I need you to step back." Instead of stepping back, she moved. The wheelchair shifted beneath me, pulled slightly off its original position. It was not a large movement, but it was enough to break whatever fragile sense of control I had been holding on to. "You have embarrassed this family enough," she said, and this time her voice was louder, no longer contained within the small space between us. "You are not doing this in front of everyone." Something inside me went very still at that sentence. Not because it was new, I had heard variations of it before, but because of where we were, because of when she had chosen to say it. The words echoed in a way that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as though the space itself was closing in. I became acutely aware of my own body, of the way my hands gripped the arms of the chair, of the faint tremor that had nothing to do with my condition and everything to do with the surge of adrenaline rising through me. "Mom, stop," I said, but even as I spoke I could feel the situation slipping beyond the reach of words. She pulled again, more forcefully, this time the motion abrupt and misaligned. The chair tilted slightly, the balance shifting in a way that I could not correct quickly enough. There was a split second where everything seemed to hang, my awareness of what was happening, my body's delayed response, the realization that I did not have control over this movement. And then I was falling. The impact was sharp and immediate, the cold of the stone floor registering through layers of fabric in a way that felt distant and precise at the same time. For a moment the sound in the room changed, as though it had been filtered or pulled back, leaving everything slightly muted. I was aware of my father's voice, of movement behind me, of my mother saying something I could not fully process. But beneath all of that was a different kind of awareness. One that cut through the confusion with unexpected clarity. This was happening. Not in the abstract sense, not as a possibility I had considered and dismissed, but in the immediate, undeniable reality of the present moment. I was on the floor minutes before my wedding because my mother had decided that my body did not align with her expectations. The thought did not come with panic the way it might have years earlier. Instead, it settled into place with a kind of cold steadiness, as though my mind had shifted into a different mode entirely, one focused not on what should have been, but on what was. And what was in that moment was a situation I had not chosen but would have to respond to. The moment my body hit the floor did not feel dramatic in the way people imagine moments like that to feel. It felt precise, almost clinical, as if every sensation had been separated into its own distinct signal. The cold of the stone pressed through the fabric of my dress, the angle of my hip registering first, then the sharp awareness of impact spreading outward in a delayed wave. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed suspended, like the world had paused to acknowledge what had just happened. Then sound returned all at once. My father's voice strained and uncertain. My mother's words still insistent, though now fractured at the edges. The faint shift of movement from somewhere beyond the chapel doors where the ceremony had already begun to stir. It was not chaos in the loud cinematic sense. It was something more disorienting, a contained disruption compressed into a space too small to hold it. I tried to orient myself without moving too quickly, instinctively running through the same internal checklist I had learned over years of managing a body that could not always be trusted to respond predictably. Pain localized, sharp, but not catastrophic. Awareness intact. Movement possible, though not yet tested. Beneath all of that, there was another realization, quieter but heavier. This had not been an accident. The angle of the chair, the force of the pull, the words that had preceded it, none of it aligned with something incidental. My mother still stood near the wheelchair, her hands hovering uncertainly now, as if the outcome had not matched the intention she had constructed in her mind. There was something unsettled in her expression, not quite regret, but the beginning of recognition that something irreversible had just occurred. Before I could fully process that thought, the door to the chapel opened. The shift in the air was immediate. What had been a closed, contained space was suddenly connected to the larger world beyond it. I could sense movement, attention redirecting, the collective awareness of dozens of people beginning to turn toward something unexpected. And then he was there. Dr. Marcus Webb moved with a kind of efficiency that cut cleanly through the confusion, his presence anchoring the moment in a way nothing else could have. He crossed the space quickly and lowered himself beside me, his focus narrowing to the essentials with practiced precision. "Claire," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "Are you injured?" "I don't think so," I answered, surprised at how even my voice sounded. "My hip, maybe." "Don't move yet," he said, already assessing, already mapping the situation in a way that felt both immediate and methodical. His hands hovered just above contact, careful, deliberate, ensuring stability before anything else. In that moment, everything else, the tension, the confrontation, the awareness of the audience beyond the door, receded slightly, replaced by something more structured. A system. A response. He stood after a few seconds, and when he turned, the energy in the room shifted again. My mother had not moved far. She was still close to the chair, still within the center of what had just happened, though her posture had changed, the certainty that had driven her actions replaced now by something less defined. "Doctor." Webb held his phone in one hand, not raised dramatically, not used as a threat but present, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried the same tone I had heard in examination rooms, for years measured, factual, impossible to dismiss. "I'm Dr. Marcus Webb," he said. "I am Claire's neurologist. I have been treating her for 9 years." There was a pause, not for effect but because the information itself required space to land. "I recorded the last portion of this interaction," he continued. "What just occurred constitutes physical assault of a disabled individual under state law." The words did not echo, but they settled heavily into the room, reshaping it. This was no longer a private disagreement, no longer something that could be minimized or reframed. It had been named clearly and without ambiguity. My mother opened her mouth as if to respond, but whatever she intended to say did not fully form. The narrative she had maintained for years, that this was exaggeration, that this was performance, had collided with something concrete, something documented. Something that existed outside of her interpretation. "I just wanted her to," she began, but the sentence did not complete. "I'm going to need you to step back from the chair," Dr. Webb said, not raising his voice, not adding emphasis but leaving no room for negotiation. For a moment it seemed like she might resist, that the same force that had driven her actions seconds earlier might reassert itself. But it didn't. Something in the clarity of the situation, in the presence of someone who understood both the medical and legal reality of what had happened, shifted the balance. She stepped back. Around us, the rest of the space began to move again, slowly, cautiously, as though everyone was recalibrating. Dina was beside me now, her presence steady and familiar, grounding in a different way than Dr. Webb's clinical precision. Hands reached to help, voices lowered the immediate focus, returning to the practical, getting me upright, ensuring I was stable, restoring some version of order. The vestibule, which had felt so contained only moments earlier, now carried the weight of what had just occurred, the air altered by the recognition that something irreversible had taken place within it. As they helped me sit up, the world came back into alignment in small increments. The pain in my hip sharpened briefly, then settled into something manageable. My dress was adjusted, smoothed, returned as much as possible to its intended shape, and through it all there was a strange underlying clarity. The moment had already happened. It could not be undone, reinterpreted, or softened into something else. It existed fully formed, with witnesses, with evidence, with consequence. And yet, even within that realization, there was another one, quieter but equally certain. I was still here. I was still in the vestibule. The ceremony had not yet begun. The life waiting on the other side of those doors had not disappeared. The moment had reached its peak, but it had not ended the story. What followed did not unfold with urgency or panic, but with a kind of deliberate calm that felt almost constructed, as if the people around me had collectively decided that this moment would not be allowed to define the rest of the day. Dr. Webb remained at the center of that shift. After ensuring I could safely move, he coordinated the immediate response with quiet authority, speaking briefly to the wedding coordinator and the staff in a tone that balanced professionalism with clarity. There was no dramatization, no escalation beyond what was necessary, only a steady handling of facts. He made it clear that an incident had occurred, that it had been documented, and that it would be addressed appropriately later. But for now, the focus returned to me, to my physical condition, to what I needed in order to continue. With Dina's help, I was guided carefully back into my chair. The movement was slow and controlled, each step intentional, as though we were re-establishing equilibrium, not just physically but emotionally. My hip protested briefly, a sharp reminder of the fall, but it held. That mattered. I tested my weight, adjusted my posture, and felt the familiar process of recalibration take place inside me, the same process I had relied on so many times before when my body had done something unexpected. Josephine appeared moments later, her presence immediate and grounding, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder in a way that said everything without words. She did not ask questions right away. She did not need to. The look in her eyes held a certainty that nothing further would be allowed to happen to me without resistance. Around us, the space settled. My dress was straightened, the fabric smoothed carefully, as if restoring it could help restore the moment itself. Someone, Eleanor, I would later realize, pressed a cool pack gently against my hip, her movements practiced and unobtrusive. The wedding coordinator, Patrice, moved efficiently between us and the chapel doors, managing the situation on the other side with a professionalism that kept the larger event intact. I could hear faint murmurs beyond the doors. Then quiet, then nothing at all. A pause had been created, and within that pause we were given the time to decide what came next. Dr. Webb returned to stand in front of me, his attention focused fully, not as my doctor in a clinical setting, but as someone who understood the weight of the moment and the choice it required. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was not asking for a surface answer. He wanted the truth. "My hip will hurt," I said after a brief assessment of my own, "but I can continue." He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more affirmation than reassurance. "Then we continue," he said simply. The decision settled into place with surprising ease. There was no internal debate, no hesitation. The alternative to stop, to let what had happened take precedence over everything else, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to something that did not deserve that level of power. This day had been built over years, not just months of planning, but years of navigating my condition, of building relationships, of choosing a life that accommodated reality rather than denying it. That foundation did not disappear because of one moment, even a moment like this. The final preparations happened quickly after that. Josephine squeezed my hand once before stepping back toward her place inside the chapel. Dina adjusted the last details of my dress with practiced care. The ice pack was removed, my posture reset, my breathing steadied again. I focused on the rhythm of it, on the familiarity of returning to myself after disruption. It was something I knew how to do. It was something I had been doing for years. When the signal came that we were ready, there was a brief stillness, a collective pause before movement resumed. The doors to the chapel would open again. The music would restart. The sequence, interrupted but not broken, would continue. I positioned my hands on the wheels, grounding myself in the physical action that would carry me forward. For a moment I allowed myself to think of Daniel waiting at the end of the aisle, unaware of the full details but steady in a way I could rely on. That image anchored me more than anything else. Then the doors opened, and with that the day moved forward, not as it had originally been imagined, but as it still very much was intact, chosen, and mine. My mother did not stay to see how the day unfolded after that moment. Sometime during the delay, those quiet, carefully managed minutes, when everything was being put back into place, she left the chapel. My father left with her. There was no confrontation, no final exchange of words, no attempt to explain or repair what had just happened. Their absence was not announced, but it was felt later in the subtle gaps where they should have been two empty chairs. Two missing voices in a room otherwise filled with warmth and celebration. I learned about their departure not from them but from the wedding coordinator, who told me gently, as if delivering information that needed to be handled with care. By then the ceremony had already resumed, the vows had been spoken, and I had become a wife. The fact of their absence did not undo that, but it settled into me with a weight that was difficult to name, something between loss and clarity. In the days that followed, the practical consequences of what had happened began to take shape. Dr. Webb, in his role not just as my physician but as a mandated reporter, filed a formal incident report. The event was documented not as a misunderstanding or a family dispute, but as what it was: an act that crossed a legal boundary. He provided his recorded footage as part of that documentation, and for the first time the situation existed outside the private sphere of family dynamics. It entered a system where facts mattered more than interpretations, where actions carried defined consequences. I was told that I had options, that there were legal paths I could pursue if I chose to. I met with an attorney weeks later, not because I had made a decision but because I needed to understand what those options meant. The language used in that office was precise, careful, and heavy in a different way than anything I had experienced before. It reframed the moment in terms that were both validating and difficult to absorb. And yet, despite the clarity that documentation and legal structure provided, the emotional reality remained far less resolved. My relationship with my mother did not end in a single definitive moment. It fractured, and then held in that fractured state, suspended without closure. We did not speak after the wedding. There were no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation, no acknowledgement from her that aligned with the reality I had lived through. The silence stretched across weeks, then months, becoming its own kind of answer. My father called occasionally, his tone careful, his words circling around the event without ever fully landing on it. He asked how I was, how Daniel was, how work was going, but the space where something more honest might have existed remained untouched. My sister reached out once, a brief message that carried more honesty than anything else I had received. She said she was sorry she hadn't done more, and I believed her. But even that did not resolve anything. It simply added another layer to a situation that refused to simplify itself into something easily understood. What remained in the absence of resolution was a quiet recognition that some relationships do not repair themselves just because time has passed or because the significance of an event demands it. Some things remain unfinished not because they are waiting for an ending but because the ending itself is uncertain. I have learned to sit with that uncertainty, not comfortably but honestly. The legal questions are still there, the possibility of action still open but not yet chosen. The emotional reality is there too, less structured, less defined but equally present. My mother is still my mother. The history we share does not disappear even as the distance between us grows. What has changed is not the past but my understanding of what I am willing to carry forward from it. In the months since the wedding, I have found myself returning again and again to a realization that did not fully take shape until everything was over. The day was never saved by a single moment. It would be easy to point to the intervention, to the clarity of what happened in that vestibule, to the way the situation was contained and addressed in real time, and say that was the turning point. But that is not the truth, or at least not the whole of it. What carried me through that day, what made it possible for the ceremony to continue, for me to move forward down the aisle, for the life waiting on the other side of those doors to remain intact, was something that had been built long before any of us arrived at that chapel. It was the result of years of learning how to live honestly within the constraints and realities of my condition, of refusing, sometimes quietly and sometimes with effort, to shape my life around someone else's version of what it should look like. 9 years is a long time to build anything, but it is especially long when what you are building is not visible in the traditional sense. There is no clear blueprint for how to construct a life around chronic illness, no single moment where everything aligns and remains stable. Instead, it is a process of adjustment, of trial and error, of learning where your limits are and how to work with them rather than against them. It is choosing doctors who tell you the truth, even when the truth is difficult. It is surrounding yourself with people who do not require you to translate your experience into something more comfortable for them to accept. It is making decisions, small, practical, often invisible decisions, over and over again until they accumulate into something that resembles stability. By the time I reached my wedding day, that structure was already in place. It had been tested in ways that were quieter but no less significant than what happened in those few minutes before the ceremony. What that moment revealed more than anything else was the difference between a life built on denial and a life built on acceptance. My mother had spent years trying to reconcile my condition with a framework that did not allow for it, attempting to minimize, reinterpret, or reshape it into something that felt manageable within her understanding of the world. But reality does not adjust itself to fit belief. It exists as it is, whether it is acknowledged or not. The life I had built, by contrast, was rooted in that reality. It did not depend on everything going smoothly, or on my body behaving in predictable ways, or on other people agreeing with the choices I had made. It depended on truth, on recognizing what was real and then building around it with intention. The wedding in the end was not a perfect day, but it was a complete one. It held both disruption and continuity, both conflict and commitment. It was not defined by the moment when things went wrong, but by the way everything else held steady around it. The years of support, of careful decisions, of relationships grounded in respect and understanding, those were the things that made it possible for the day to continue, for it to remain meaningful despite what had happened. And in that sense, the wedding became something more than a single event. It became a reflection of the life that led up to it. A life shaped not by the absence of difficulty but by the presence of people and choices that made that difficulty manageable and in many ways meaningful. If there is anything I understand more clearly now than I did before that day, it is this: the hardest part of living with a chronic illness is not always the illness itself, but the pressure to reshape it into something more acceptable for other people. There is a constant, quiet expectation to minimize, to explain it away, to make it less visible so that it does not disrupt anyone else's comfort. For a long time I tried to meet that expectation. I tried to present a version of myself that was easier to understand, easier to accept, even when it meant stepping away from what I knew to be true about my own body. But that approach comes at a cost, one that accumulates slowly until it becomes impossible to ignore. It distances you not only from others but from yourself. What I have learned instead, through experience, through failure, through the steady presence of people who refuse to let me disappear into that kind of compromise, is that there is a different way to live. It is not easier, and it does not remove the challenges that come with uncertainty or limitation, but it is more honest. Living truthfully with a chronic illness means acknowledging it fully without apology and without distortion. It means making decisions based on what your body actually needs, not on what would make the situation more comfortable for someone else to witness. It means allowing your reality to take up space even when that space makes others uneasy. That kind of honesty becomes possible, or at least sustainable, when you are not carrying it alone. The people who stand beside you matter in ways that are difficult to overstate, not because they fix anything they can't, but because they recognize what is real and respond to it with respect instead of resistance. They listen without questioning the validity of your experience. They adjust without making you feel like a burden. They show up consistently, in ways that are often quiet but deeply significant. Over time, that kind of support does more than help you manage the practical aspects of illness. It reshapes your understanding of what you are allowed to expect from the world. There will always be people who do not understand, who interpret what they cannot see through the lens of their own fears or limitations. Their disbelief can be loud or subtle or disguised as concern, but it does not define the truth of your condition. It never has. The danger lies not in their misunderstanding, but in the possibility that you might begin to internalize it, to question your own reality in order to maintain connection or avoid conflict. That is the line I have learned not to cross, not anymore. If I could offer anything to someone standing where I once stood, it would be this: hold on to what is true, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is difficult to explain. Keep the people who believe you, who respect your experience without requiring proof. Build your life around that foundation, not around the shifting expectations of those who cannot or will not see it. Because in the end, it is not their acceptance that will sustain you. It is your own. And the presence of those who meet you there without hesitation.